I never thought I'd hear his voice again, but there it was, soft, familiar, and somehow still mine. My son dropped me at the front desk with 2 suitcases and a promise he'd visit soon. He didn't look back. I watched his car pull away through the glass doors, and I felt the weight of being 70 settle differently than it ever had before. The lobby smelled like lavender and old carpet. A woman at the desk smiled too brightly and handed me a key. She said my room was on the 2nd floor, that lunch was at noon, that I'd make friends here. I nodded and said nothing because I didn't trust my voice yet. I'd raised him alone after his father passed, given him everything. But somewhere along the way, I became a burden he needed to put down. He never said it out loud, but I saw it in the way he sighed when I asked him to visit. If stories like this touch you, feel free to like and subscribe. I carried my bags up the stairs myself. The hallway was long and quiet, lined with doors that all looked the same. I found mine at the end. Inside, the room was small but clean. A single bed, a dresser, a window that looked out at the garden. I set my suitcases down and sat on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked softly beneath me. I opened the top drawer of the dresser. It was empty except for a Bible and a folded piece of paper with emergency numbers. I closed it again. I didn't cry. The afternoon light came through the window in pale stripes. I watched the dust motes drift through it like tiny, aimless things. That first week passed in a blur of routine. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. I ate alone at a corner table. The others laughed and chatted like they'd known each other for years. The food tasted like nothing. At night, I lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the building, footsteps in the hallway, a television murmuring through the wall, someone coughing 2 rooms over. I'd close my eyes and try to remember what home felt like, but all I could remember was the emptiness. The garden became my refuge. I'd walk the gravel paths in the afternoons, letting the cool air settle my thoughts. The trees were bare, their branches black against the gray sky. It was November, and everything felt like it was waiting for something. I'd sit on the benches and watch the fountain trickle, the water catching the light in small, fleeting ways. I didn't talk to anyone. What I saw next made my whole chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. I was walking past the sunroom when I heard it, a man's voice, low and steady, reading aloud from a newspaper. Something about the rhythm made me pause. I glanced through the doorway and saw him sitting by the window, his back to me, his shoulders slightly hunched, a wool sweater, silver hair, the same way he used to tilt his head when he concentrated. He turned the page, and I caught a glimpse of his profile. My breath stopped. It couldn't be him. Not here. Not after 50 years. But I knew that face. I knew the way he held his head, the shape of his hands, the quiet way he existed in a room. Joe. His name rose in my chest like something I'd buried too deep to reach. I stepped back before he could see me. My heart was pounding in a way that felt both strange and familiar. I walked quickly back to my room and closed the door behind me. I sat on the bed again, my hands pressed flat against my knees. Joe. We'd been young once, 22, and full of plans that never came true. We talked about marrying, about building a life together. He wanted to teach music. I wanted to open a little bookshop. We'd sit on his porch and dream out loud, our hands folded together, the future stretching before us like an open road. But my parents had other ideas. They said he wasn't stable, wasn't serious, wasn't enough. And I listened. I let them pull me away from him. I let them choose my life for me. I married someone else 6 months later, a man my mother approved of, a man who gave me a son and a house, and 40 years of a life I never quite felt at home in. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd sometimes think of Joe. I'd wonder where he was, what his life looked like, if he ever thought of me. I never saw him again. Until now. I wasn't ready for the feeling that name would bring back. The next morning, I went to breakfast early, hoping to avoid him. But when I walked into the dining room, there he was, sitting alone at a table by the window, stirring his coffee slowly. He looked up as I passed, and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then his face softened, and he nodded. Just once. A small, quiet acknowledgement that said he knew who I was. I nodded back and kept walking. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my tray. I spent the rest of the day in my room. The truth was, I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't know how to face the choices I'd made 50 years ago. I didn't know if he hated me or pitied me or felt nothing at all. That afternoon, I found him in the garden. He was sitting on one of the benches near the fountain, his hands folded in his lap. I hesitated at the edge of the path, watching him. He looked older, of course. We both did. But there was something about him that hadn't changed. Something steady. Something kind. I walked over and sat down beside him. We didn't speak right away. The fountain trickled softly between us. A crow called from somewhere in the trees. The air smelled like wet leaves and approaching winter. He said my name finally. His voice was gentler than I remembered. I whispered his name back. He smiled just a little. He mentioned how long it had been. I agreed quietly. He looked down at his hands. He told me he didn't think he'd see me again. I admitted I felt the same. We sat in silence for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else. Something that felt like relief. Like two people who'd been holding their breath for 50 years and finally remembered how to exhale. He asked how I'd been. I almost laughed. How could I even begin to answer that? I told him I'd been alive, that it was something. He nodded slowly. He agreed it was. Over the next few months, we became friends, not in the way we'd been before, but in a new way. Quieter, steadier, more honest. We walked the garden paths together in the afternoons. We sat in the sunroom and read in comfortable silence. Sometimes he'd tell me stories about his life, his daughter, his years working as a teacher, the wife he'd lost to cancer 10 years ago. I listened, and when he asked, I told him about mine. I didn't tell him everything, not at first, but slowly, piece by piece, I let him see the parts of me I'd kept hidden for so long, the loneliness, the regret, the quiet ache of wondering what might have been. He never pushed. He just listened. And somehow, that was enough. We celebrated small things together. When the first snow fell in December, we stood by the window and watched it blanket the garden. When Christmas came, we sat together in the common room and listened to carols. On New Year's Eve, we stayed up past midnight, drinking weak tea and talking about the years we'd missed. He told me about his daughter's wedding, about the students who still sent him letters, about the summer he spent in Maine. I told him about my son's childhood, about the garden I used to keep, about the books I never got around to reading. We didn't talk about what we'd lost. We didn't need to. It was there in every pause, every glance, every moment of silence that felt too full to break. Something in the silence between us shifted that I couldn't name. One evening in early spring, we were sitting on the bench in the garden. The air was warmer now, and the trees were starting to bud. Joe was quiet, his gaze fixed on the fountain. I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. He'd been moving slower lately, taking longer to catch his breath after our walks. I'd pretended not to notice, but I had. I asked if he was all right. He didn't answer right away. Then he turned to me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Something tired, something resigned. He told me softly he wasn't going to be here much longer. I felt my chest tighten. I asked what he meant. He explained the doctors had told him a while ago. His heart was worn out. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said he'd had a good run. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The fountain kept trickling. The birds kept singing. The world kept moving like nothing had changed, but everything had. I managed to ask how long. He said they didn't know. Could be months, could be less. He looked back at the fountain. He told me he wasn't scared, that he'd made his peace with it. I reached over and took his hand. His skin was cool and papery against mine. I whispered I wasn't ready. He said he knew. He told me that was all right. We sat like that until the sun went down. The next 3 years didn't pass the way the doctors predicted. Joe held on longer than anyone expected, but he grew weaker, his steps slower, his breaths shallower. We still walked the garden when he could. When he couldn't, I sat by his bed and read to him. Mysteries, poetry, old newspapers, anything to fill the quiet. Sometimes he'd fall asleep mid-sentence, and I'd just keep reading until the nurse came in. I held his hand when it hurt too much to move. I brought him tea he couldn't drink. I told him stories about things that didn't matter just so he could hear my voice. And in those quiet hours, I realized something I'd been too afraid to admit before. I loved him. Not the way I had at 22, when love felt like fireworks and promises, but the way I did now, at 73, when love felt like presence, like showing up, like staying. I never told him directly, but I think he knew. Only then did I realize what he'd been trying to tell me all along. Joe died on a Tuesday morning in late summer. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd gone to breakfast thinking I'd bring him something back, but when I returned, the nurses were already in his room. They came out and told me gently, their faces soft with practiced sympathy. I nodded like I'd expected it, but I hadn't. Not really. I went to his room afterward. It was empty now, the bed stripped bare, the window open to let in fresh air. I stood there for a long time, looking at the space where he'd been. The light came through the window the same way it always had. The fountain outside kept trickling. Everything kept going like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. On the nightstand, there was a small envelope with my name on it. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a photograph, old, faded, creased at the edges. It was us, 22 years old, standing in front of a carousel at the county fair. We were smiling, his arm around my shoulders, my head tilted toward his. I didn't even remember the photo being taken. I'd forgotten we'd ever been that happy. I turned it over slowly. On the back, in his careful handwriting, were just 4 words. You were always enough. But beneath them, in smaller script, was something else I hadn't noticed at first. A date. The day we'd stood in front of that carousel. The day before my parents told me to leave him. He'd kept this photograph for 53 years. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held the photograph against my chest. And for the first time in 50 years, I cried. Not for what we'd lost, but for what we'd found. Not for the life we didn't have, but for the quiet, gentle years we did. Joe had given me something I didn't know I needed. Not a second chance. Not a do-over. Just a reminder that love doesn't have to be loud or perfect to matter. It just has to be real. It just has to show up. I keep the photograph on my dresser now. Some mornings I look at it and smile. Other mornings I cry. But either way, I feel him there. Steady, kind, and somehow still mine. I realize now that goodbye doesn't erase love. It just changes how we carry it. I still walk the garden paths. I still sit on our bench by the fountain, and sometimes when the light hits the water just right, I feel him beside me. Not in a way I can touch, not in a way I can hold, but in a way that matters. My son visited last week. It was the first time in 3 years. He looked older, tired. He apologized for not coming sooner. He said he'd been busy. I nodded and said it was all right. And it was. Because I'd learned something Joe taught me without ever saying it out loud. Some people show up, some people don't. And that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of theirs. Have you ever reconnected with someone from your past and discovered they were exactly what your heart needed?